Hi, Freddie. Good to see you.
Hey, Mark Phipps, how are you? How is everything?
Thank you. I'm
Good.
recovering after my long walk yesterday at the big protest on the Harbour
Recovering.
Bridge.
Like the protest and the walk that you experienced is anything compared to what is going on in other parts of the
But
world.
anyway, it
All
was a
right.
momentous day yesterday. More than 100,000 people crossing the Harbour Bridge, so
Hmm.
pretty iconic. And the voice of Australia has been loudly heard, I think, in terms of the disgust everyone feels about what's going on in Gaza. So it'll be very interesting the political impact and perhaps the impact it has, hopefully, in Gaza at some point. I know Anthony Albanese is trying to get a phone call with Netanyahu. So it'll be interesting to see what impact this has and whether this really is a turning point in Australian politics or this whole Gaza situation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think don't let's talk about the actual protest itself a bit more as well, because I think that obviously it's very easy in today's political climate to say that you are supporting Gaza and that you support them against what the IDF is saying, because it's what every newspaper and every politician in the world seems to be coming to that conclusion, right? Like the tide has officially turned. And I worry, and I think a lot of people worry that it is too late for these actions. Obviously, it's never too late. It's better now than never. But so many people have died, and so many people have starved, and so many people are on the brink of starvation. So these actions only happening now, will they be able to get the food that they need in the next few weeks? I'm not sure about that. But I guess that desperation is what brought like an estimated more than 200,000 people out to the protest yesterday. So I mean, it was really quite impressive. I think it was the first time that the Harbour Bridge has been closed since World Pride, which happened a while ago. Was that in 2000?
So, yes.
Yeah. But what did you feel being there? Like, talk about your experience. Like, what supporters did you see? Was it very peaceful? What was the
Look, it
police
was
reaction?
really a cross section of society. First time I've been in such a protest ever, so that was interesting for me. Real cross section, people with young children, strollers, families, older people, obviously people who are of Palestinian background and people sympathetic to that with Middle East background, etc. But really a cross section of society. It was very peaceful. It was very sort of calm and sort of celebratory in a way. People were kind of very communicative with the police and respectful and not pushing, etc. And so, look, it was really very nice. I mean, the only confusion was really by the police when we were getting towards the northern end, and they were concerned about crowd control of everyone stampeding onto Milson's Point Station.
Mm.
And so they texted people in the crowd, uses geo positioning to text everyone's phones in that location, and the police helicopter had a loudspeaker trying to communicate because it's hard to communicate this point to 1,000 people. We want you to turn around and go back the way you've come
Yeah,
when
for
you've got this
sure.
huge crowd, and there was potential for more crowd crush that way. So I still don't understand to this day why they just didn't let the crowd dissipate on the North Sydney side. I mean, they could have closed off Milson's Point Station, but they know more about this crowd control than I do. So it was just when you're in the protest, it was somewhat confusing.
Yeah, I suppose they do, but I mean, it feels very conflicting that they would decide to do something like that when the only people who had, put out any information on the protest were the Palestine Action Group, and they had very clearly said the protest will go from here to here. So you would think a cause of crowd crush and of panic would be the police randomly changing like the direction of the protest itself and making you turn back feels like, I don't know, just an unnecessary like provocation of the whole thing. But then
Well,
it usually.
for me it was interesting because I caught the train and I planned to walk north over the Harbour Bridge and then walk home, right? And of course I live on the north side, so then I had to turn back and go all the way back to the southern side
That
and
bad.
then climb over the fence to the walkway on the right hand side and walk right across. But there was quite a lot of confusion, and so I think for some older people, maybe it was a bit distressing because they had to walk a lot further than they anticipated.
Mm.
But look, anyway, it was an amazing experience, very memorable. I won't forget it. And hopefully it makes a difference.
I mean, definitely. And I think as well, it's important to ask ourselves the question, right? Because you just talked about how it was very peaceful and fairly well coordinated, aside from the bizarre moves done by the police. But, no one was violent, no one was doing anything unprecedented. It wasn't chaos. And that's what Chris Minns said. He didn't want Sydney descending into chaos when he said that he would not allow this protest to happen. And that's quite a landmark situation as well, because in Australia we have the right to protest. The government should not be allowed to restrict us from protesting. But recently they passed quite a massive law saying that you can't protest near some like religious places of worship, which sounds good and preventative, of course, but it's just a big change from having no legislation around protesting to having some legislation. It feels like it's going to keep continuing in that way. And then you get to the point where, a massive community group is deciding they want to very peacefully protest across our city's bridge, a symbol of Sydney, and show our opinions and beliefs, which I think a lot of people share at this point. And the government is so scared or worried, or they don't think that it's in the interest of the people to let that happen. I mean, I just think it goes against everything the Labor Party has ever said that they believe in. And I
But
don't
Freddie,
know.
there is a balance, right? I mean, you can't shut the Harbour Bridge every weekend, right, for a protest,
No,
right?
I'm not. Did I say that?
I know, but if
Did I
you
say that?
no, you didn't say that, but
No, I
you
didn't.
also said that, the government, look, there's a balancing act here, right? You can't, like I said, you can have protests, smaller protests, and which are not shutting down a major artery of the city, but,
Yes, but don't you think that more than 200,000 people was enough to shut down the Harbour Bridge? And don't you think that the issue in Gaza is enough to shut down the bridge?
well, yes, in that case, yes,
Yeah.
but
Well, I'm talking about this case.
I know, but you gave the impression that, they should just have carte blanche and the police or the government shouldn't have a
Not to
say.
do with the Harbour Bridge. I'm not saying they can shut down roads every so often willy-nilly. I'm saying that we should be allowed to protest
Oh, I agree with
in
that. The
general.
question is the size of it and where, right?
Well, yeah, of course, but that's not what I'm debating. I'm just saying that we should be
Thought
allowed
you
to
were.
protest, that we live in a socialist, like democratic country. We should be allowed to protest. They should not be putting restrictions on that. I understand that there would have potentially been issues with the Harbour Bridge, but I think that it's really disappointing that Chris Minns didn't work with the Palestinian Action Group or work to come up with any solutions and rather just barred it. And obviously the Supreme Court disagreed with what he said, and then they cleared the protest and gave it some special allocations. So I think they ensured that the police would be there to make sure everything proceeded properly and that all the roads were shut down officially from a certain time to a certain time. So, I just think it's an interesting question of what our rights are in this country. And I think that, the government should be careful starting to tell people when they can and can't do things when they have shown absolutely no action towards Gaza. And what more do they need? 200,000 people walking across the Harbour Bridge. What more do they need to show that this country is wanting to change our position and to put sanctions on Israel and to stop shipping weapons parts? Because I don't know if you heard this, Penny Wong, in a few parliamentary statements, has been asked, look, are you still shipping weapons to Israel? And she said, oh, we're only shipping parts of weapons. But the parts of those weapons are still going to the army, so that's not a real response.
Yep. Well, it'll be interesting how this plays out. A lot of pressure on Albo to continue his balancing act as Prime Minister, but that's why he's in the role. So it'll be very interesting.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if he's doing a fantastic job right now. What kind of balancing act are you doing anymore? We're the last of our kind of middle power country to even consider recognizing a Palestinian state. Canada is already in the process of thinking about recognizing them. Germany is also considering it. The UK has also said that they will recognize it, given certain details. France has also done that. What more do you need? Like, I don't really understand what's holding
If you
him back.
listen to
I
the
think it's
government's policy, they say it will happen. The question is they're going to do it on their own schedule.
Yeah, they want to ensure Israeli security before anything else. And I even question, do we have far stronger ties to America than we pretend to have? Do we consider them such a strong ally that this is going to distort our policy on such a thing? Maybe that's why the UK and Canada are looking to recognize a Palestinian state, because they don't feel as close a relationship with the US. I feel as if when I was younger, at least, they usually looked up to them. And and aspired to this kind of American superpower.
I think they have just as close a relationship. I don't think it's that. I think
Well
it's a
then, yeah, well then what's
difference
the
in
reason
leadership,
is all
really.
I'm saying.
Mm.
Yeah.
All right, so yes, hopefully it has some sort of positive impact. But anyway, people had their voice heard, and so that's a positive thing for a democracy like
Yeah, it's a
Australia.
positive thing, but everyone's still dying.
So moving to a discussion around Mandani, the new Democratic candidate for mayor of New York. So he's got the Democrat nomination. Trump calls him a communist because he's clearly on the left wing of the
I
political
mean, he's
spectrum.
definitely a socialist. I think he's
Definitely a
far,
socialist.
far further left than most Democratic nominees tend to be. I mean, he beat out quite a few further right, more conservative Democratic nominees. So I think Andrew Cuomo, who has supported Israel in some of their actions in the past. So this is a big statement. This happened a little while ago, around June, the end of June, but it is a big precursor, I guess you could say, to the midterm elections that are going to be coming up soon, because it shows that New York and maybe America has changed who they want to vote for. They're voting for someone who's more progressive than they ever have before in the state of New York. So what does that say about how people are pushing back against the Trump administration itself and looking for new leadership?
But I also think it says something about Mandani as well, the balance. He's sort of pro-business, but he's socially progressive as well. So, and I hear he's a great communicator as well. So you've got to have the right sort of candidate to, enthuse and get that energy behind things. So it will be interesting whether which is a model for a new style of Democrat and, the re-establishment of the Democratic Party, because as you know, it's still in a total mess in the US.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's the style of politician and politics that Bernie Sanders has always pushed. And so it's interesting that that kind of rhetoric is coming back around. And, you look at AOC as well, and you see how these figures are becoming more and more prominent in the last year or so. And I think it will say interesting things for the next American election. But just coming back to Mamdani for a second, I know it's quite interesting when it comes to Gaza. I think this is the one thing that really distinguishes from the rest of the nominees, is that obviously he's very outspoken on everything happening in Gaza. And he has even said that if Netanyahu came to New York, they would arrest him, because, there's a warrant out for him by the International Criminal Court, so he would arrest him. And the journalist kind of asked, well, federally, your government has not said that they would arrest him. That's not the federal government position. But he said, look, New York agrees with international law, and that's what we would do in that situation. And I know Netanyahu was questioned on that. Do you feel worried? Do you feel worried about going to New York in this situation? And Trump said, ha ha ha, don't worry about it. I'll get him out. I'll get him out of New York.
Mm-hmm.
So, look, it's getting a bit feisty there, but I think it's interesting seeing some pushback.
That's very interesting. On other news, Trump has given a new deadline for Putin to make a ceasefire in the Ukraine. Originally, he'd said he was going to give him 50 days. He's now reduced that to 10 to 12 days, and that's up on August 9th. And so it will be fascinating whether Trump actually takes action based on his words, whether he continues to be Taco Trump and not do what he says he's going to do.
Yeah.
And so hopefully that's the case, because, whilst everyone's focus now is on Gaza, the Russians continue to make progress in Ukraine and bomb the hell out of Kiev and other cities, etc. And so that's kind of, like we say about people's interest is short-lived in stories around the world. Currently, Ukraine is, on the back burner of people's minds.
Yeah, and I think an interesting narrative to look at on that as well is kind of the end of the media institutions themselves, right? Because it's happened, right? The media institutions have begun to lose their power and begun to lose their institutional funding. So what they've got to do is find newsworthy stories that are punchy, that are new, that are talking about the new kind of it thing that's going on in the world. And they can't really afford to keep going back to something like Ukraine, which has been going on for so long, because how are they going to get the right viewership? And I think the media has such a powerful position that it's really dangerous that they've begun to, you know, be biased towards what their readers want to read rather than telling stories of what's actually happening out there in the world. So it'll be interesting how that also affects Ukraine, because obviously they are at a very critical point as well. I mean, anytime that Ukraine falls, it means the rest of Europe is suddenly in huge danger. So look, I think everyone needs to turn their attention back to that. But there's too many critical conflict points at the moment, and I think it's difficult for our foreign policy advisors to focus.
It is interesting what Ukraine's doing at the moment. They did a huge cyber attack on Aeroflot, the Russian airline, and so no flights were running because their whole system is brought down, right? They infiltrated the Aeroflot system, and supposedly the CEO at Aeroflot had not changed his password in 3 years, right? His password for their systems and stuff. So, and they also made an attack on a oil refinery in Sochi. And so what's interesting there is the Russians like going, the wealthier Russians and middle-class Russians like going to Sochi in summer, right? Like they like going to Turkey and to Dubai, etc. So this lack of any Aeroflot flights, and also where people's children are on holiday and that sort of thing in Sochi, is very interesting, attacking the middle class and upper class in Russia so that they're feeling some impact from this war as well, which has not been the case before.
Well, definitely. And I think strategically, right, the one way that people see an end to this war and an end to even Putin's position as leader is the middle class rising up against him and, some sort of revolution happening. Obviously, the chances of that are incredibly low, but I think Ukraine believes that there must be a point where it gets so bad for the Russian population that they don't want to be in war anymore. I mean, obviously it takes a massive toll on a country's population. They're having family members go off and die, and how many sons and how many daughters, I don't think they conscript women actually for the army, but how many sons do you have to lose off at war before you decide to turn your attention to your leader? And why are we in this war in the first place? Is it necessary? So I wonder what that will have an impact as well. If their luxury vacations are being threatened, maybe they won't look so favorably on Putin anymore.
So interesting developments there. And then closer to home, we have a productivity summit coming up by the federal government in the coming weeks. And this is all around the point of, this term, as Jim Chalmers has said, is all about productivity. Australia's productivity is terrible, right, in terms of any improvements.
And I think it's been declining for a long time as well.
Declining for some time, particularly since the pandemic, since COVID. So the whole idea of this summit is to get industry groups and business council and government and unions and everyone together to have a look at this and cover a few areas like a potential corporate tax overhaul, competition reform, AI adoption and workplace readiness, workplace innovation, public health as productivity, and state versus federal roles in that whole thing. So I think it's wonderful that they're having this because, too often and hopefully the real topics will be discussed, right? Tax reform, etc., in terms of housing supply and deregulating the housing supply and all this stuff, because these things have become so partisan between the parties that you weren't even able to discuss or look into doing research on tax policy, or else you'd be criticised by the opposition. So I think it's generally a positive thing. Let's see how it pans out.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's really interesting that we have a Labour government who has not made any changes and has not done any substantial tax reform aside from the over 3 million on
superannuation,
super savings. So it's really interesting that there hasn't been any reform. So that's really states a turning point maybe in Labour's policy. And I think there's a lot of industry groups, union groups that support the Labour Party that are going to be looking for some changes there and are going to be asking, hey, we want a better situation for ourselves. We want greater taxes on the wealthy. And I don't know, we'll see what happens with that.
I think you're right. And I think that the government is in a position where they could take some bolder moves. For example, governments in the past have never been able to address any of the negative gearing thing. It's been political suicide. But if they did come up with a reasonable policy to say, in a period of time, in the next 3 years, you can wind back the 50% discount on capital gains after a year. Yes, people will squeal about it, but I think this is a sensible thing to do. Again, over time, if you were to limit the number of negatively geared properties or the value of properties to more than five, again, a reasonable thing. Most people would have. It's a bit like the $3 million thing. It doesn't impact most people, but it sets a foundation for the future of a sustainable taxation system, and one where you can sustain it. And one other topic that did come up was charging companies on their turnover as opposed to their profit, which would be a big new thing. And that would then therefore catch the likes of Amazon and Microsoft and others who pay very few taxes in Australia. If they had to pay on their turnover in Australia, they'd suddenly be paying a lot more tax.
Yeah.
So very interesting stuff.
No, definitely. It really is. And we'll see what happens with that, and we'll see the fallout on the Labour Party, because I know you say that most people don't care about these changes, but I've found we have a few Liberal voters in our extended family, and we have found that there was bizarre pushback against the over 3 million super fund taxes, even though we're very aware that these people do not have over 3 million in their super. So it's very confusing why people would be scared about that or think it's going to affect them. But apparently it does. I think that the word tax reform scares people, and it starts ringing alarm bells in their head regardless of what it is or what the specifics are.
I think people think it's a slippery slope, so if it starts one thing, then eventually it might impact.
And ideally it is a slippery slope.
So,
So
that would be fascinating to watch. It would be good. I don't know how you get invites to such things. Do they invite press? Maybe they should invite podcasts just as a productivity summit.
We should just send an email. Just inquire.
We should.
Yeah, we should.
Why don't you do that, Freddie? You're in Canberra.
I can. That's fine. I'm the producer of the radio.
Yeah, that's true. Bring it up. All right, Freddie, lovely to chat and speak to you today. You have a great week, and great chatting with all of you. Hope you all have a great week.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.